Welcome back to Rare Connection, where we bring voices from the community together to share stories, science, and support. I'm your host, Joanna, and today's guest is Ben, a rare disease researcher and advocate with over 15 years experience in cell and molecular biology, clinical research, and leadership. He played key roles at Sanford Research, including leading the CoRDS Rare Disease Registry and the Experimental Therapeutics Screening Facility. Ben also lives with lymphatic colitis and oral lichen planus, two conditions that many rare or lesser known diseases don't always get the research attention they deserve. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. Nothing shared on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. The conversation is for informational purposes only, informational and educational purposes only. Always speak with your healthcare providers before your about your own health or about your own health or treatment decisions. So Ben, can you share your journey with lymphatic colitis and oral lichen planus and how it began?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, Joanna, thank you for welcoming me onto the podcast. It's really great to to talk to you, get to know you a little better, and tell my story. So my name's Ben. I've lived as a rare disease patient my whole life, and I have two autoimmune diagnoses that are considered rare. One of them is lymphocytic colitis, and the other is called oral lichen planus, and they both involve the digestive system. And so my whole life, as a kid, I had I would go through periods of time where I would have just really bad pain, and it was localized to like my stomach area, but I could never really pinpoint where it was or what was going on. It was just more of a chronic burning pain, and it would come and go. And I guess the advice I got was just that it was, maybe I was just fighting off a little virus or something, and that's what happens. And as I got older, things got to be a little bit more dramatic, where I would, be in my mid 20s. I might be 250 pounds, and without changing anything about my diet or anything, I would just drop a lot of weight over the course of a few months, and it was unexplained. I would feel real gross, and I'd be real lethargic and not have a lot of energy. And so I began to go to the doctor, and in 2020, I think it was, that was when I received my final diagnosis after years of talking to folks about things and visiting physicians. Just like so many rare disease patients you live with, this diagnostic odyssey that people talk about, is a real brutal thing to deal with. And the irony there is that I spent probably 8 years of my career working with rare disease patients and patient advocacy groups and talking about these kinds of things before I realized that I was going through it myself. And then I got my diagnosis. It was rare, and I thought, oh my gosh, like how dense can you be here? And and so when I finally figured out what was going on, there was a steroid treatment that I was put on, that helped clear things up. I was on steroids for about 9 months, And the thing that my GI physician was most concerned about was that, especially lymphocytic colitis, is a disorder that's essentially your immune system, your lymphocytes, your white blood cells, line your whole uh, colon, your whole digestive system there, and they begin to attack that tissue, that mucosa that just lines the inside of your intestines, and you can imagine it kind of like gumming up the works. It has consequences where you don't absorb things as well, and it becomes very painful at times. And then there's all sorts of unsavory GI symptoms that go along with it. And so the concern that my physician had was that this is usually something that occurs in older folks. It's something that kind of develops or is becomes problematic later on. And so a steroid treatment, long course of steroids, isn't usually something they have to worry about. At the time, I was in my early 30s. And so they said, you're just too young to have you on a constant steroid. And so they said, let's try to taper off of that, and hopefully it will go away. There is kind of a one-time version of lymphocytic colitis that you can cure with a course of steroids, and it may never come back again. You might not ever have another flare. But then there's more of a refractive type, which is what we kind of assumed I had, since it has come and gone over my whole life. And yeah, sure enough, as soon as I went off the steroids, everything came back. And so, that was something that I did. Really, I joined a Facebook group that, did what folks do. You try to find other people who can relate, and you ask them questions like, how are you dealing with this? And that's when I adopted a diet, an autoimmune diet that's been developed by physicians and dietitians and patients, where I can eliminate some auto-inflammatory foods and just kind of help control the severity and the frequency of flares. They definitely don't go away, but the ones that I do have are relatively short-lived comparatively, and not as severe. And so that's kind of how I'm dealing with it. But as a part of that, your immune system is your immune system. And so I have another diagnosis called oral Lichen planus. Lichen planus is like a dermatological disorder, and it's not rare. People get it. It can look like little ulcers, or it can look like a little webby pattern of rash on anywhere on the skin. It is rare to have it in the mouth, and people don't. I saw a dermatologist, I saw a rheumatologist, ear, nose, and throat. You kind of went all around, and everybody kept saying, this really isn't what we do. So I finally said, well, who does? They're like, well, a dermatologist or somebody who should be able to handle it. And that's ultimately where I wound up getting my diagnosis. And there's two types of that too. One of them is called refractive oral lichen planus. That's really not painful. It comes and goes, and it looks a little bit like a white webby pattern within the cheeks or the gums. And it's an auto-inflammatory sort of a situation. Your white blood cells are activated there, and they're attacking your own cells, your own tissue. I have the other variant that's called erosive oral lichen planus. And with that, you develop mouth sores. And so that's been a common theme throughout life too. I've had more canker sores than anyone I've ever known. And that's kind of what I've treated them as. But probably for the last 18 months in particular, I have always had at minimum a half dozen canker sores in my mouth at any one point in time. And there's just really not much I can do aside from putting a topical steroid on them in my mouth about 4 times a day. And that helps kind of keep them settled down a little bit so that they're not so inflamed. but they are still there, still very sensitive to hot food, spicy food. And that also makes it hard to keep a good nutrition, keep weight on, keep healthy in other ways, because it hurts to eat. So you kind of only eat when you have to, and it becomes that becomes disruptive to your life. And so, as a researcher, working as a researcher, understanding rare conditions, and then moving into a system where I'm much more of an advocate, working with patient registries and working with advocacy organizations to help with their research strategy. I really, really got to feel part of the community in a different way. And I was able to relate to people's stories. And more than that, I was able to look at people who were getting diagnoses, not for themselves, but for people in their family, like their kids, and understand the motivation, the passion behind what they were doing to go start an advocacy group or go get involved in an advocacy group. There's a fiery passion there that really is pretty unrivaled, and I have always respected it. But I, after being diagnosed, began to identify with it. And so, that as the course of my disease and my diagnosis and things have progressed right along with my career, I now work full time as a self-employed business owner. I help specifically rare disease patient advocacy groups with their digital marketing websites and stuff. But I also will just have conversations with people, talk through research strategy, talk about gathering patient data. How do you engage with researchers? All of those kinds of things, because I do truly believe that patients in rare disease, when there's not a lot known, patients are the ones with all the answers. And if patients aren't effective at getting in touch with communicators, aren't effective at getting their message out, then that slows the whole system down. And so I want to be a part of people's progress. I want to be a part of the overall drug development pathway becoming a lot more approachable, becoming a lot more accessible to the rare community, and speeding up things like therapy development and approvals. And so that's kind of, the backbone of me as a rare disease patient, a little bit of me as a rare disease researcher, and now me as a business owner with a company focused on helping those in the rare community.
So, yeah, as a former researcher, did your medical experience help or hinder you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that uh, it depends on the time. I think that you could look at it a few different ways. The one side of the coin is that uh, a decade and a half of reading scientific literature and working for a hospital system and working closely with physicians and medical teams. um, I can fairly readily speak that language, and so I can sit down in an exam room with my physician and have a conversation about what exactly is happening, biologically, and if they recommend a therapy, what's that mechanism of action, and have those conversations, because I'm curious as a scientist. I always want to understand and
Mm.
have an idea of what's going on. And so in that way, being a scientist has helped, because I can kind of understand the underlying biology as I learn more. And that has helped me explain things to other patients. But it's also helped me try to understand where the gaps are in knowledge within my own conditions that I've been diagnosed with. Now, the other side of that coin is that sometimes having information is more of a burden than a blessing. And so knowing those things while trying to stumble through it, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, because you're constantly thinking through all of these worst case scenarios and all of these wild things that could go wrong. And that understanding of how excuse me, how diseases can progress, can make that whole experience a lot more anxiety driven. And so I think that it's helped me have conversations. It's helped me understand, but at the same time, it feels overwhelming sometimes with the grand scope of it all, and trying to know that I don't have any more answers than anyone else, but have that kind of need in my mind to try to find them without any resources.
Um, do doctors take your symptoms seriously or right away, or especially with something like oral lichen planus, or which is often misunderstood?
Yes. Yeah, that's another great question. There's a common tale told within the rare disease community where a patient goes and sees their primary physician, and they feel dismissed or they feel misunderstood or unheard. And that's certainly been part of my story. That's certainly been part of the journey that I've been on. But I do want to point out that is not for lack of physician compassion and the care. My physicians, at least, have always been very honest about saying, this is about what we know. So I can answer that question, but I can't answer the next one. And and so I think that with the oral lichen planus as an example, like I said, for about 18 months or 2 years, I've had canker sores in my cheeks. And this has been the worst, most chronic flare that I've been dealing with. Is come and gone. So there have been periods in that 18 months where I haven't had any, but they come back, and it's been this really annoying period of time. And I saw a number of physicians during that time, and they understood what I was talking about, and they understood where I was coming from and my frustration. But the answer that I would get a lot was, I think you're just biting your cheeks in your sleep. And so it was buy a mouth guard, sleep with a mouth guard on, and then that didn't help. And so it was, well, maybe get a mouth guard for your bottom teeth too. So you've got a mouth guard on your top teeth and on your bottom teeth, and try sleeping with that. And they still didn't go away, and they're still there. And so it was this really long period of trial and error to finally arrive at a spot where it was like, I don't really know what we can do here. Doesn't seem like there's much that you respond to. And so it's just a matter of trying to find the right sort of like an oral steroid cream that I can put in my mouth every day to try to keep them as calm as they can become.
Yeah. So how did living with these conditions reshape your perspective on clinical research and healthcare delivery?
Yeah, it's been absolutely critical in my understanding of how things are working and going. Like I said earlier, I worked at a hospital system, so it was a large hospital system in a rural part of the country, and so especially in this area, the plight of rare disease patients is made just that much more difficult because you don't have access to the whole machine. You don't have access to the healthcare system in the way that you would if you lived in a more populated area. There are people that live in my part of the country that have to drive 2 to 3 hours to see their doctor, just one way. And there's or longer. There are women that travel 3-4 hours for prenatal visits, and so it's a thing where healthcare is not readily there for you. And so when you live with a rare disease, it's even more isolating than I think people give it credit for. And so as my story has played out, and I became a leader in a clinical research department and became involved with learning all of the ins and outs of how the FDA wants people to conduct trials and everything, I started to get an understanding of, well, I have this disorder, and I can look up papers, and I could look through the literature, and I can see that there's a lot of conflicting information. I can see that there are different conclusions from different hospital systems. And there doesn't seem to be like a really robust consensus about like how we can approach things and what we can do to fight against it. The other thing that I noticed was that a lot of things were based on really small numbers of patients. So there might be like a research study done at one university, and maybe they include 20 patients or something. And then they have their conclusions drawn from it. And there's really good like anecdotal evidence there. And it gets you right on the right path. But just like with every rare disease, you're never going to really achieve that like powerful statistical significance to say this is, what we've got to do. So as I understood clinical research and as I worked with the hospital system, that's when I began to get really much more involved or much more thinking about the use of healthcare data, healthcare delivery, as medical records are electronic now. Then we're not, at least in most places, we're not keeping paper medical records anymore. The push towards AI in healthcare. How can we take all of this data, this massive pile of data that the healthcare system has collected about each of us over the course of our lives, and then how can we multiply that across a diagnosis and help ourselves? And so, my interest in trying to dive into and understand the data behind healthcare delivery, between the receiving healthcare, what's in your medical chart, and then balancing that with the survey results that you can collect in a patient registry. Say, okay, yeah, we've got all these lab values, but that doesn't tell us how well this person sleeps at night. That doesn't tell us how often this person feels sad. There's all kinds of different quality of life things that you have to collect too. And so, yeah, I think for easily the past 10 years, as I've progressed with my disorder and come to understand where the clinical research industry has kind of fallen short in looking at that sort of thing, I myself have just kind of begun to become more and more interested in learning and understanding how different healthcare systems within the US, how different healthcare systems in different parts of the world collect their healthcare information, where that data is stored, how people can merge it together, and then how overall can we use new tools like AI to uncover correlations or uncover linkages between different things that just would not have been seen before. So I think that has shaped my view of clinical research and my view of research in general quite a bit. And I think that we're in an exciting time as those tools are being developed and as those things are coming out, because I do think that we might be able to uncover some more causative ideas about what's behind all of it.
Mm-hmm. So you worked at the CoRDS Rare Disease Registry. How important are registries for undiagnosed conditions like yours?
Yeah, I think that if you have, I'll back up and I'll just kind of say let's say that I've received a diagnosis for disease X, and it's been observed. People know that disease X is a thing, but most doctors haven't ever seen a patient with it. And there have been a couple of researchers who maybe were like stumbled across a gene or something that could have been causing something, but that's really all they know about it. And so there's this disease out there that I just got diagnosed with, disease X, and I want people to research it. I want there to be a therapy that can be used. But the people who would develop that therapy, the researchers, the universities, the physicians, the pharma companies, they don't really even know where to start. They don't know anything about it. And so to even get that process kicked off, I have to be able to share my story. I have to be able to tell those people what life is like with disease X. And with their expertise and with their knowledge and their understanding of how the body works, how biology is supposed to go, they can maybe hear that story and then get some ideas. Oh, maybe this is maybe the kidney is involved here. Maybe there's some renal biology. Maybe this is a cardiac thing as well as a neurodevelopmental thing. They can draw their own ideas, and then they have something to go research. And they can find ways to use their ideas to generate some preliminary data. They can use that preliminary data to write grant applications and receive funding to study it more and more. And as more people like me with disease X tell our story through a patient registry, those researchers are empowered with more and more information to steer their ships toward finding a cause and developing some sort of a remedy or a therapy for disease X. So, for the question, how important are patient registries? It's critically important. That's the foundation of it all, from my perspective. When you start way back at the beginning of that story with disease X, I think about all of the families out there who have kiddos with rare conditions, or of all of the families out there who have multiple people in that family with the same rare disease, yet nobody really knows what to do with it. They have to be able to share their story easily, readily, and that information has to be accessible to the people who can do something with it easily and readily. So working with the CoRDS registry, that was really something that we targeted. From that perspective, we built that registry so that it would be free. It wouldn't cost anyone anything to access the data or to contribute data. That there wouldn't be any sort of blockade against access to anything. If a person applied with a reasonable research purpose, then they could get access to the information, and it was all de-identified and stuff, of course. But putting together a platform and putting together a system where people can do just what I was saying, where they can just answer some questions to give researchers the information they need to get started, is that the very basement level of figuring out what's behind a rare condition.
Now there's Rare X also, but it is another.
Yes.
Um, but
I had the pleasure of being a part of working with the folks early on with Rare X, and
yeah,
I've worked with them on a couple of different projects where we were trying to harmonize some data. Take some information from our registry about a few diseases, take some information that they had about those same diseases. We've got different information. How do we combine them? So then those two data sets become even more powerful for researchers.
yeah.
And I think that there needs to be a lot more of that. The folks with Rare X that I've worked with, and certainly the people at CoRDS, but Global Genes and all of those bigger organizations. The Every Life Foundation is another one, advocating for policy changes in DC. All of those groups have this really, really well laid out system for cooperating with each other and for collaborating. And I think that as a professional, that's always been one of the most refreshing things about the rare disease community, is that we can all sit here and go, yeah, we're all like, I've got these challenges, but I can look out at this like vast sea of people who have one of or multiple of these 10,000 other rare disorders and understand that they all have the same problems. And so you can then take people from different rare communities and say, we have different diagnoses, but the challenges we're facing are the same. Our diseases might be completely and totally different, but we're still trying to overcome the same sorts of barriers, where we need to come together and figure that out. And so professionally, I've always just been so impressed and so relieved to find how readily people want to work together on things, and that I've carried that spirit into my own business. I'm genuinely here to help.
Yeah. I find that most rare disease patients also have more than one.
Yes. Yeah.
And I have very few people I know of only have one. And a person in England that I talked to put it perfectly. He says, some people collect stamps, some people collect coins. I seem to collect rare diseases. Do you really need two kinds?
You got to collect something, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I wish I just stopped at baseball cards instead of diagnoses,
yeah,
but no, it's true. I think, I'm no exception. I have two diagnoses. I think that there's something to be said for that because in my case, both of them are immune conditions, and the immune system is just like every other system in our bodies. It's like at its basis, um, it's developed built from our genes, from our DNA. And so, one of the things that I hope we can do as a research community, or that I hope that the healthcare and medical communities can put together for us going forward, is that we can use some of the data that we know, leverage tools like AI and some of those other things to say, hey, Ben's got these two diagnoses. They're both autoimmune, they're both part of the GI system, but they present in very different ways, and they're in different parts of his GI system. And they are diagnostically two very different things. But does he really just have one genetic anomaly that's causing both of them? Right now, there's really no way to answer that question without just throwing darts at a wall. Spaghetti at the wall is the analogy, and just seeing what sticks. And I hope that AI tools like AI, or integrated research using
mm,
big data, can help researchers have a lot more of a targeted place to start when they're trying to figure out some of those genetic underlying causes of disease.
yeah. Uh, so, um, yeah, I talked to one person who doesn't even have a name for their condition. There's very, I can't even imagine that situation. It's
Yeah.
not even be able to talk to people about it because and she ended up being a teacher with a lot of these. I mean, she
Yeah.
works with home care, she works with with EMS, a whole bunch of different healthcare systems, and so um, but it's basically a genetic code is all she has to to go
Yeah.
off of.
There was a time when people they used to name diseases. I guess maybe they still do to some extent, but diseases would be named after whatever researcher discovered them, usually. Sometimes they would be
Mhm.
named after the first patient documented and stuff. And so you wind up with things like Down syndrome, where there's
Yeah.
an investigator with the last name Down who described
Yeah.
it. So there's things that go that way. Um, some of the problems that have gone along with it is that it's not descriptive at all. So if you didn't know what that was and you just heard it called Down syndrome, you have no idea what's going on at the face of it. Whereas if you said trisomy 21, you'd know, oh, they've got 321, chromosomes 21.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that they've gotten away from that a lot. And so, yeah, you do wind up with people having a rare condition undiagnosed. There's really no idea what's going on. Usually they go do some genetic sequencing, and the sequencing results come back with these things that are called VUSs, variant
Yeah.
of unknown significance. And basically they say your genetic code seems to be okay, with the exception of like this little region here. You've got these VUSs, and I can't tell you that they're causing your disease, but this gene seems to be mutated, in a way that could cause your condition. And there can be like a little bit of a cascade from that. And so then you wind up with new diseases arising, and they're just named after the gene that's mutated. And so then there's this alphabet soup kind of a thing that you wind up with, where instead of Down syndrome, somebody's last name, you wind up with like um, CACN1A. It's kind of a
Yeah.
similar thing. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, she has a trisomy 6 and a Q4. So there's a
Sure.
Q4 syndrome,
Yeah.
but
Oh, and
trisomies
you.
are a little less.
Oh, okay. You wind up with with interesting things too. For instance, you can have Angelman syndrome, which is a
Yeah.
deletion on the 15th chromosome, I believe. But in that same region, if instead of a deletion, you have a duplication, then you have a completely different rare disease. And they tend to call that, Dup15q is like a name for it. And so you can have the same part of your DNA like messed up, for lack of a better word. You can delete things, you can add multiple things, you can change the way they're written. Depending on what's going on, you can have different disorders entirely. And that's another thing that just makes it so complicated, because a lot of times there's not just one gene that's causing things. There's multiple mutations in multiple genes that create this like perfect storm of awful biology, and you wind up with a disease. So I think that some of that is, beneficial, and some of it can be, harmful too, because this doesn't really lend a lot of information to somebody who's living with the disease to basically say, yeah, you don't really have a real name for this.
Yeah. That's worst case scenario right there. And
Yeah.
do you see patterns between mucosal autoimmune diseases like yours, or should you be studying these overlaps more closely?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have like a strong background in understanding some of the dermatological stuff. I can say though that I have oral lichen planus. My mother has oral lichen planus. I have some others in my family with it. There must be something genetic going on there, uh, because it seems to be hereditary. On the
Mm.
other hand, I have an aunt with a disease called Behçet's syndrome. And Behçet's syndrome is another autoimmune disorder. And part of that is ulcers in the mouth. And so that was one of the things that I was tested for too. I didn't wind up having the autoantibodies for Behçet's. And so we were able to rule that out. But Behçet's comes with other mucosal issues. You get ulcers in the lining of your eyes, in your tear ducts, and the insides of your eyelids. You get ulcers in your nose, your anus, your genitals, and they're incredibly disruptive to your quality of life. And it's kind of the same thing. You can throw a bunch of steroids at it to try to calm everything down, but there's not a whole lot else that they can do for things like that. So thinking of these two different diseases that are in my family that are both autoimmune, that both impact mucosal membranes in a similar way, that those types of observations that I can just make in my own life are interesting to me, because it just highlights that maybe there is something underlying these things that we just don't understand. Maybe there's some part of the genetics of immunity that we can't quite tease out. And the exciting part of that for me is that time and time and time again, there's story after story of breakthroughs being made in rare disease research to understand what's going on with the person's illness that immediately translate to common disease. We know so much about how the body works and how the human body is supposed to work by studying what's gone wrong when it doesn't. And so you can take a disorder where something's off, there's no real ready explanation for it, and then they can do some genetic testing and say, oh, here's what's going on. You have this biochemical pathway is messed up, and we've never seen that. We actually didn't know what that protein did, but now we know what it does because we know what happens when it's broken. And so if it gets broken in other ways, that can help them figure some things out too in terms of therapies. And so there's a lot of cases where we've used things like precision medicine and looking at like one individual genetic sequence to help understand how biology is working. And so, yeah, if there are underlying things that connect mucosal disorders or things like that, especially within my one family and their different diagnoses. That makes me feel excited for the potential in discovery there. And then who knows what can fall out from that? Who knows where that information could lead medicine overall? And that's just one tiny example. That's something that could play out across any disorder.
Mm. So, what do you wish researchers and pharma teams better understood about patient experience, especially with rare overlooked symptoms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what should what should researchers and physicians and the medical community know? Like I said before, I don't I've heard multiple cases, and some of them are very well deserved. Don't get me wrong, but I've heard a lot of cases where people, you know, have some real salty experiences with researchers or with physicians where they've been rubbed the wrong way, they've been outright dismissed, and that happens. Unfortunately, it's horrible. But I think for the most part, physicians and scientists are just as curious and motivated to figure out what's going on with you as you are. And when they don't have a ready answer, it's a hard conversation for them to have with you. And it's a hard conversation for you to receive because you've gone there to get help. That's your body's not working, you go to the doctor. That's what that's what we do. And when they can't offer relief, that's scary. I think it's scary for them too. And so one of the things that I've always tried to work on is, especially through the CoRDS registry, is finding ways to connect those two groups of people, where you have researchers, physicians, medical community, and then you have patients on this other side. And I always made this joke where we are working with patient groups to collect information about what life is like, and then we're sharing it with researchers. I'm a patient and a researcher, and so it's like I feel like a chaperone at like a seventh grade dance where like I've got one group on one side of the gym and the other group on the other side of the gym. And like they both really want to dance with each other, but like nobody wants to come out to the middle of the floor. And so it falls on, groups that have a foot in both worlds to try to find ways to bridge that gap. I think one of the big things that I wish the research community could embrace and even leverage a little bit more is that the patients have that story that they want to tell, that they need to tell. And I also wish that researchers could understand that a patient is maybe not going to get really super excited because you can now accurately measure their enzyme levels or something like that. It's like, yeah, that is really exciting. Cool. How's that going to help me sleep tonight? Like, how's that going to make my blood pressure go down? How's that going to make my anxiety go away? There could be any sort of big disruptive disability that your disease is causing, and I think sometimes researchers are looking so deeply into like the biology of it that it's unintentional, but I think that it's easy for you to lose sight of the fact that there are human beings out there living with this thing that's wrong, and that framing success has to also be framed in a way that translates to success for them. You can't just say, now we understand what this protein does, so this is great news. Because a patient's going to say, awesome. So like next month, will you be able to release a drug I can take? No, it doesn't work like that. And so I think there's this understanding of what's valuable to the different stakeholder groups. And then when talking about big wins, there also has to be some sort of a dialogue to explain why that's such an exciting win. And it goes two ways. Maybe the patient community has been really successful in building a group of people and gathering data in a registry. And so if they say, we've got 100 people that have filled out our survey, a naive researcher or somebody who's not really into the clinical research side of things might be like, okay, cool, but I can't do research on questionnaires. There has to be some sort of an explanation to say, well, yeah, but this information tells you what life is like. And you might be able to do some work down the road that can provide some relief. Or the work you're doing today could provide relief for future patients. So I think that I don't know that there's necessarily a thing like content that I wish researchers in the medical community knew. I think they already know it. I think everybody already knows it. There just needs to be a lot more straightforward, frank, honest, respectful dialogue between those two groups as research goes on, especially when patient groups are funding it. There has to be some sort of an understanding of, where are the deliverables, what rights does the patient group have to the data? All of those kinds of things have to be fleshed out, or those things go sour fast. They can anyway, and they do. So, those kinds of things I think are important.
Yeah, I know a lot of times doctors don't want to go outside of their own specialty.
That's very true. And they might be discouraged from doing that. They're in a hospital system. They have their departments and they have their things built out in a certain way so that they can compartmentalize different areas of therapy. They can put people who focus on similar diseases and things together. It just makes the system flow more easily. And so, yeah, that in my own experience, showing up to my primary care to say, hey, I've had these canker sores in my mouth for like 9 months. And I've gone to see three different people. I've gone to a dentist. I've gone to all these, and nobody can tell me what's going on. I need you to tell me what's going on. And then, 6 or 7 referrals later, I'm back in her office and we're looking at everything. And it's just kind of like, all right, well, the most likely diagnosis seems to be this rare disease called oral lichen planus, and yours seems to be this erosive, type. And so I think that cascade of referrals is part of the frustration we have as patients, but it might be the most efficient way to get there for the hospital system and the way that the whole machine is built. And I think we could probably have an entire other podcast about how the healthcare infrastructure, how going to see your doctor translates to them, prescribing a drug and you going and picking it up at the pharmacy and then your insurance paying for it, or as is often the case, not paying for it. And so you wind up being in all of these troublesome situations just because of the way the machine is built. And so I think that there could be a whole other conversation there.
That's actually a Dr. Seuss book.
Oh yeah.
They actually wrote a book. It's called You're Only Old Once.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna look that up. I have not heard of that.
Yeah, he wrote a couple of books for adults also. Somebody gave it to me when I was working in a residential care facility.
Oh.
And it's available on Amazon as everything else.
Yeah, right. Well, Dr. Seuss is big in our house. I've got 4 kids, and I think I've read. I thought that I had read every Dr. Seuss book out loud probably a million times, but now I'll get to add one to the pile.
Yeah. See, what has helped you most in coping with physically, mentally, emotionally with chronic symptoms and stigma?
Support from those around me, from my wife. I've often told her I don't really I can't imagine how tough it's got to be to be married to somebody who just constantly got like these weird medical things that we have to get chased down. It's frustrating, it's expensive, it's painful, puts pressure on her. I mentioned during flares I get really tired. One of the big reasons that I've pushed so hard to become self-employed was just the amount of time that I was spending working would get balanced by getting home at the end of the day every single day and sleeping for like 3 or 4 hours. And then waking up and having my own dinner by myself and then going to bed later. And um, it just wasn't a good way to live with the family. And so I say all of that because in spite of my own conceptions about how much living with somebody like me would suck, my wife still does it. And she's there every day and she's patient and she takes care of it. She does the things that I can't when I can't. And she's always there for me 100%, the best partner I could ever ask for. And so for me, it's that support structure that has made it easier to cope with things and easier to wrestle with stuff. She's
Mhm.
been there when I struggled without a diagnosis and I was, anxious and depressed and all of that. She was also there when I was able to get a diagnosis and finally have some papers to read and finally have some things to look into and feel like there's some hope. And so this whole roller coaster ride for me, not having to ever go through it entirely by myself has been the big thing. And a focus of mine on advocacy, I think, is powered by that feeling. If I can relate to someone else with a chronic health condition and their life situation means that they have to go through a lot of that themselves, that's why we have advocacy. That's why we have advocacy organizations. That's why we work so hard to build communities. Is because you shouldn't have to deal with a rare condition by yourself. You should have people who can at least understand, willing to sympathize, sit there with you while you rant for 45 straight minutes. Talk to you after every confusing doctor's visit you go to, and all of it. So I think that that's been a big force behind my desire to become more involved in helping people who are trying to help the patients, help people living with it.
So a big part of this is connection. It's just why I call it our connection, but I have connected people with by email, and also I have a Facebook group called Our Connection also. Have you connected with others who live with these conditions, or are there support groups out there?
Yeah, I have. So I belong to a couple of different Facebook groups. One is for people with just general autoinflammatory disorders. That's where I get a lot of my information about making this diet work. It is a very disruptive diet. I've had to eliminate refined sugar, grains, dairy, soy, and so I basically eat, meat, fresh produce. I can eat like sweet potatoes, that kind of stuff, nuts. But I can't have, the stuff that I've loved my whole life, pizza, can't do it.
Mm.
So I think that I've picked up most of my favorite recipes through groups like that and getting to know them. But from a patient perspective, I'm part of a lymphocytic colitis group. I should back up too. Lymphocytic colitis is a subtype of a larger diagnosis called microscopic colitis. That basically just means you have this inflamed digestive system, and the only way that it can be diagnosed is through a colonoscopy and a bunch of biopsies that they take throughout it, and then looking at your cells under a microscope. And so there's two types. One of them is it's more of a like collagenase, sort of a collagenous colitis is what it's called.
Mhm.
And so there's the that in that situation, unlike mine where it's lined with lymphocytes with active immune cells, in collagenous microscopic colitis, you wind up with scar tissue lining the whole intestine. And that scar tissue is real tough, and that can prevent uh, things from being absorbed. That scar tissue itself causes inflammation, causes pain. And and it brings about a lot of the same symptoms. And so, yeah, there's things like that. There's even a school of thought where lymphocytic colitis and collagenous colitis are just two phases of the same disease that hasn't really been identified yet. Where for a while you have your immune system attacking your tissue, and then after a while your tissue builds up scars on top of that, and so you migrate from one into the other, and there's no evidence for any of that. It's all kind of conjecture, and there's no evidence for anything because it's a rare disease. And so getting to know other patients through those communities is good. The other thing that I think has helped me, especially with lymphocytic colitis, is that it's not considered rare in some communities and in some parts of the world. And so, this is a really dramatic example or analogy, but you can take something like sickle cell anemia. In Finland, sickle cell anemia is probably pretty rare. That's a very rare condition because it's a disorder that predominantly affects people who are from sub-Saharan area, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from places where there's a lot of mosquitoes. And the sickle cell disorder, from my understanding, is something that lends some not immunity, but resistance to developing malaria if you're bitten by mosquitoes. So because that's an advantage, it's genetically carried out. I think that with something like that, when you're in a more like in Africa, I actually had a conversation with a guy from Ghana, and I was asking him about rare diseases in Ghana, and sickle cell anemia came up because that's something that we talk about as being rare here in the United States. And he kind of said, "Oh, that's not super rare here. Like in Uganda, there's a lot of people that have sickle cell anemia. They still don't know any. They don't, they still know as much as anyone else, but the incidence is higher. And so with lymphocytic colitis, it's higher in European populations than in others. It is considered rare according to the U.S. government with their GARD database. But in Europe, it's considered chronic, uncommon, or something like that. We have these arbitrary kind of definitions of where things fall. And one of the things that they do know is that lymphocytic colitis impacts women over men in a ratio of something like 9-1. And so this is much more common for women to have this than for men. And it's a lot more common for women who are beyond menopause or older in their age than younger, like in their 20s, although that does happen. And so when I was learning all of this and going through my diagnosis and talking to my physician, and they were telling me that this is usually something we see in women in their 60s that are 70s, like in a 9-1 ratio. That's just what we know. I walked out of the hospital that day thinking like, well, I can think of like one thing I have in common with women who have lymphocytic colitis, I guess. I don't really know what to do with that information. And joining that group and getting to know other men who have it has been good, I think, mentally, just because it's I can ask questions about being a guy, and having it, being part of support groups for it, can sometimes be you identify with the people in the group because you all have the same diagnosis, but maybe some of the ways that it presents are different for women than for men. And if the majority of them are women, then it's tough for me to relate in those sorts of ways, and vice versa. And so being able to connect with other guys there has been good. Has been good for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned there's a dietary option part to the lymphocytic uh, colitis. Is it how does it differ from the ulcerative colitis?
Yeah. Well, I don't entirely know, like diagnostically, how it differs. I do know that the thinking is that, and this isn't just in lymphocytic colitis. This would be across a lot of different GI disorders. There's this thing called leaky gut syndrome, and so in your colon or in your intestines, your cells are real close together, and
Mm.
they have these very small gaps. And so you can have in a healthy tissue, there's very like specific little pathways for molecules like chewed up protein, to go through. And usually, if you think about a protein like a chain with different links in that chain, in proteins, the links are called amino acids. If you're digesting food and your proteins typically get broken down into like these little chunks of chain of like three links,
Mhm.
those can pass through the digestive wall perfectly fine. And when they get into the blood, your body makes use of them and turns them into new proteins, and it helps your body stay healthy. And it's just part of our metabolism. With a leaky gut, the thought is that those junctions between the cells aren't as tight as they should be, and they're maybe a little bit open, or maybe there's not as much control over what can get through the intestinal wall. And so you wind up with these chunks that aren't three links long. It's not a little chain with three links. Maybe it's a chain with like 11 of them or something. And when those get through the wall, on the other side of it, your immune system can find those and say, whoa, I don't know what this thing is, but we aren't supposed to see anything like it in this area. And that can activate your immune system, and then your immune system starts to try to defend. In reality, there's nothing to defend against. It's your body breaking down the food you've eaten. And so that can come about in allergies. That can come about in things like Crohn's disease, or in disorders where there's a really high impact from gluten, eating gluten. That gluten has been identified as a protein that's susceptible, for whatever reason, to being broken down in that way. And people with a leaky gut can benefit from cutting it out of their diet. Um, the milk protein casein is another example of that. People will cut out dairy because there's proteins in the milk that can get inappropriately broken down and go through that intestinal wall and then cause inflammation. And I don't know that any of that is like proven, observed. I think I mean, it might be, but in terms of lymphocytic colitis, it's more of a theory than a science. I don't know that that's really solidly established, but you do see that in other disorders. And so I think that that's one reason, I guess, like for myself and anecdotally, the really the only thing in my life that has been helpful has been controlling my diet and what I eat. And at least in that example, through my own experience, that theory makes a lot of sense, I guess. Maybe there's just maybe my body just has different messed up ways to absorb things or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I find it kind of interesting that um, most of the medical professionals are on the East Coast, and all of the healthy food is on the West Coast. And it's like there's got to be some course or correlation there.
Yeah. I think there's also a high correlation between um, healthy diet, health outcomes, whether it's a rare disease or not, and socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
And so there's that thing where if you can't afford to buy healthy food, you don't get healthy food. And if the reason you can't afford to buy healthy food is because you've got a whole ton of medical debt from a rare disease, then
Yeah.
just by virtue of the way you were born or the way you were made or by whatever whatever means your disease came about, I mean, they're always out of our control. Um, just by virtue of that, now your whole life is impacted.
Yeah.
You're, and so um, I, I think that there's a lot of like, it's all tied together, and it all comes down to having a giant impact, not just on your quality of life as a patient, but on the quality of life of your family, of your kids, of everything, because it does impact you economically, impacts your overall health, access to healthy food, those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, it impacts your ability to even go be seen for the healthcare that you need.
Mm.
So yeah, it's all one big large ball of twine that I think is really hard to unravel. But there's a lot of people out there trying, thankfully.
Yeah. There, so the there's a bill for, I know it's connected to ulcerative colitis, but I don't know about the others. The It's called the Medical Nutrition Equity Act that I've been fighting for probably about 20 years now, along with the rest of the metabolic condition community. Mainly, it started with PKU, but uh, I have a condition called homocystinuria that's also part of it. But it would mandate that healthcare companies follow, I mean, cover the cost of medical foods, medical formula, and vitamins.
Mm-hmm.
And so the medical formulas tend to get mixed up with the baby formulas because,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. It's, about this time last year, I was at a family conference. We helped a group build their patient registry, and the disease that they advocate for is it's interesting. It's called maple syrup urine disease,
yeah,
and so I was at a group, a family conference, and they had a lot of patients there. There was a large contingent of the Mennonite population that was there. It's very, very interesting to get to know them and understand what their lives are like with the rare disorder. But those folks are lacking an enzyme that gets used to break down protein, and so one of the approaches to it, if you can diagnose someone early enough, is you can put them on these formulated foods that have this enzyme that they're missing. At least I think that's how it works. I could be
yeah.
getting that
That
wrong.
is how it works. They have 4 different amino acids, so there's a branched chain amino acid.
That's right.
So with mine, it's methionine,
Okay.
PKU is phenolene. There's also tyrosinemia, which has a problem with
Oh
tyrosine.
yes, I have heard that. Yes, yes. So there's these like medical foods.
Yeah,
it's like your drug, but you eat it.
kind of. Yeah, it's you. So the medical foods are basically designed. They have no protein. Um, so they have very little. They have very little protein, like
That's right.
less than a gram.
Yes.
And if you have a tolerance of like under 6 grams a day, which some of the kids do.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen tolerances as low as 2 grams a day. It's crazy.
Yeah. They were talking about that. I mean, it was like, how do you live on 2 grams of protein?
Medical foods formula. The
Yep.
formulas don't have the amino acids that we can have,
Yep.
and so that's how they differ. They just take out that amino acid, and
Yeah. That's right. I was thinking that they were like providing a protein that you weren't able to make or something. So they're limiting the kinds of protein that you can't digest.
right. So yeah, but we do have to have, everybody has a different tolerance, but like mine is pretty high. It's 30 grams a day. But and I'm currently on a clinical trial which just got extended for another year.
Oh, okay.
And so it's possibility that I might be able to get more. Um, and so it's that's another aspect of this. It's uh, but so anyway, moving on. What's the biggest myth or misconceptions about either of your conditions and that you'd like to discuss today?
Um, Biggest myths or misconceptions. I think that there are a lot of like um I don't know that there are like consistent myths or misconceptions, but what I will say is that um through my own experience, through my life, uh
Mm,
there have been a lot of uh attempts to try to shoehorn my symptoms into a disease that didn't really fit it exactly. So,
mm,
you wind up like taking treatments or take adjusting your lifestyle to address a health condition that you don't have. And so there are things like, oh, you just need to have more fiber in your diet or whatever. And so for a while I was consuming like a absurd amount of psyllium husk, or Metamucil is kind of like a brand name. So eating a lot of this stuff it didn't make a difference at all. Just like unnecessarily eating a whole bunch of it. It does work for some people, by the way, but not me.
mm,
And so I think that there's been a tough uh that's been tough to kind of battle against. Um, Yeah, I think that maybe the biggest misconception that I would say is that you can neatly define any either of these diseases. That there isn't a real solid picture that you could paint for either lymphocytic colitis or a lichen planus for that matter. Uh, there just isn't enough known about it, and so there's this kind of spectrum that exists across the whole thing. And some people are affected much more severely than others. And um, it can be a challenge to try to describe your experience with the disease to people who have a much more severe form of it or have a different form of it where their symptoms aren't exactly the same, and then have to have a conversation where it's like, no, we do have the same thing though.
mm,
And go from there. So I think that just as people, we want to try to put things into neat boxes and have if this box is blue, it's blue, and there's not going to be any purple things in there. It's all blue. But that's just not the way that it works.
mm.
It's kind of like the zebra as a mascot for the
Yeah.
rare disease community. It's just zebras exist. Doesn't matter if it's not the most likely cause of the hoof beats. It's just they're there.
Yeah. So what gives you hope, and what changes would you most like to see in the rare disease space in the next 5 years?
Oh, that's a big question. So, like, what gives me hope? I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier. I think that there's philosophically, I think there's a lot of things that we should be very cautiously proceeding forward with in terms of AI. But I get a lot of hope from the thought that in rare disease in particular, any one of us goes to see one doctor who diagnoses us. But we might be the only patient they've ever seen, or we might be like one of a handful of patients that they've seen. And so the diagnosis and the medical understanding of a disease is isolated into these little pockets. And all of those doctors might not talk to each other frequently enough to really paint a good picture of what this overall patient community looks like. But if you were able to train an AI, or if you were able to use AI technology to integrate some patient outcomes with medical record information and all of these things, they talk about this. They talk about this like kind of, you could think of it kind of like an AI chatbot, but it's like an AI primary physician, and this tool would have so much information at its disposal to draw correlations, to connect dots that wouldn't otherwise be able to be connected. I have a lot of hope that especially for people who are living with rare diseases in rural parts of the country where they don't have access to these kinds of things, that technology will get to a point where they'll be able to be seen just as clearly as someone who has access to every specialty on earth. They'll be able to get answers the same way that somebody else would, that lived in a much more populated place, or maybe lived in an area where, if they were in Baltimore and they could go over to Johns Hopkins, they're going to be seeing people at a very, very high level research institute, research hospital, lots of really smart people there. And that's not to discredit any like research institutions that aren't in big cities, but by any means, but they have a name, and there's a reputation there. So I get
Yeah.
hope from the thought that technology will improve to a point where we can use it to try to bring some equity to the access people have to information and diagnoses. What was the second question you had there? Sorry.
On that part of it, what changes would you like to see? Would you like
Oh,
most like to see in the next in the rare disease space in the next 5 years?
yeah. I think in the next 5 years, within the rare disease community, I think that um, we would all benefit. Well, first of all, if we were able to, um, if we were able to put like our voucher system back in place for rare drugs and the rare drug approval pathways through the FDA, if we were able to over the next 5 years revive and improve upon the FDA's previous approaches towards allowing fast track approvals and moving things through in a way that provides a little flexibility. If I was studying, I'll use breast cancer as an example. Breast cancer is a devastating, horrible disease, deserves all the research it can get. It's also very common. And so if I was going to do a clinical trial on breast cancer and I needed to have 300,000 breast cancer patients in order to statistically say whether my drug works or not, it would take a lot of cooperation and it would take a lot of work. But unfortunately, you could find 300,000 breast cancer patients over a course of a pretty small amount of time to effectively run a trial. In a rare disease, there might not be 300,000 patients that have ever walked the face of the earth. They're in total, we might have only had 100 people. And so you're never going to be able to hit that same like statistical limit to pass muster with regulatory agencies. And in the past, or I think in a ongoing way to some extent, the FDA is really accommodating to try to provide some answers there, especially now that we're in like N-of-1 clinical trials and those kinds of things. I would like to see over the next 5 years that expand. I don't know whether that'll happen or not. And I'd also like to see I guess I'd like to see some sort of action taken by whoever would need to take it to provide more protection for rare disease patients who don't have the medical coverage to pay for the therapies that they need, or they don't have the medical coverage to pay for the diagnostics that they need in order to receive a diagnosis. Maybe there is a therapy that they could take advantage of, but they don't have the access to the diagnostics that they would need to get there. I would love to see some sort of action taken where either private insurance is required to support certain things, or that programs are created to provide resources to rare disease patients that they currently don't have. And I don't know that there's a real great path forward without that sort of a movement for a lot of those folks. And in that case, those rare diseases are just going to continue to be rare. They won't have the diagnostic leverage that they could have, and they won't have the innovations that they should have if the community was more empowered, just by having like simple access to the healthcare system.
Mm. Interesting, you're bringing up the same point as the last person I talked to on this. There's a company called Rare Gen that I talked to somebody from, and he's like a 16-year-old medical researcher and working with just adolescents. He
Sure.
felt that they should have a say in what goes on, and because they're the majority of the rare disease patients. And so, but he just went to a conference and noticed that all the researchers are in their 60s.
Yeah. It's yes. That is another problem. I think that is something that I haven't necessarily lived with as an experience myself, but I do know a number of people who have. I've known a guy named Seth Rotberg for a number of years, buddy of mine, and Seth started a nonprofit called Our Oddessy. And the goal of Our Oddessy is to take people who have rare diseases that are like graduating from seeing their pediatrician and moving into this adult world of medicine and this adult world of like living independently and dating and going to college and planning for your future while having this diagnosis that makes your life a little more spicy than others. You might not and so there's tackling sorts of issues like how seriously should I be dating if I don't know how long I'm going to live, and those kinds of things. There's not a lot of resources out there, and Seth started Our Oddessy to help with that. And there's Taylor Kane is a young woman who has Remember the Girls. I've known her for a number of years. Her goal is to try to bring attention to young people with X-linked disorders. So young women who are carriers of diseases that they have been told they don't have because, they've got two X chromosomes. And so the only people who could get them are males who don't have another X chromosome to lean on. Whereas, she, and I think a lot of the other women in their group are like, just because I don't have the disease as highly as or as obviously as a male would, doesn't mean I'm asymptomatic. I may be a genetic carrier for this thing, but that doesn't mean that like my life looks and behaves exactly like a person who wouldn't have this mutation. And so, both Taylor and Seth have kind of moved into advocacy from very young adulthood to say, I'm going to focus my advocacy on taking care of my peers who are, no longer children and don't have the network of support that children in the rare disease community might have. But they also don't necessarily have the support that they would have if they were established adults in a career with a life and and all of those things. There's a challenge there. And there's not a whole lot of support to help bridge that gap. And if you think about it more, maybe if you think about it a little bit more long term, if researchers are doing their jobs well, if everybody's playing together well in the sandbox and we're making strides forward and everybody's making progress, there's a whole bunch of pediatric diseases today that will not be pediatric anymore. If there are diseases that where children are passing away before adulthood, and we're able to do something about that and give them longer lives, then you have a different set of issues. And that's something that happened in cystic fibrosis. The cystic fibrosis community this was a pediatric disorder entirely. This was in the 80s or 90s or whatever. This was something that impacted only children. And now with advancements and with drugs that have been approved and things that are out there, you have adults with cystic fibrosis. That's an evolution within that disease's research ecosystem that I think will probably get replicated in others too, as we know more about genetics and we're able to improve our ability to provide gene therapies or gene silencing technologies to try to at least get to the root cause of a disease, extend people's lives. All of a sudden, support networks and support systems that were built to provide help to sets of parents as they're taking care of their kids need to get adjusted to support the young adults who are no longer kids and no longer being totally taken care of by their parents. Interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. So thank you so much for to Ben for joining us today and sharing both of his professional and insights and professional experiences. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find more episodes on Reconnection on my YouTube channel, Rare Chef, where I also do cooking videos there. In the audio version, you can find pretty much on any of the audio stations. Rare Connection also has a Facebook group and a Facebook page. We're also on X and LinkedIn. And there's also a private Facebook group. If you'd like to connect with our community there. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, you can comment below on the videos version of this, or there's also a link in the audio version to send me a text link in the show notes. If you like to support the show, there is also a support the show link in the show notes. Every contribution helps to keep these important conversations going. I'm also excited to share a new T-shirt that I just designed. I created for invisible disabilities awareness. This is so the sunflower is the symbol for invisible disability. I just found out.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. And it's new since 2022. It started in the UK, actually. So I combined the zebra, which is the symbol for rare diseases, with the sunflower, and so it's a zebra lying in sunflowers on the front, and then it explains it on the back. And you can pick up that shirt on Bonfire. I'll have a link in the show notes on that, on both sides. And finally, if you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help. Please know that help is available. You can call the Suicide Crisis Lifeline at 988 or text home to 741-741 to reach out to a trained crisis counselor. You are never alone. Thanks again for being part of the Rare Connection community, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.